Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Over My Dead Pod. I'm Kylie Colwell,
And I'm Holly Spear.
and I've had this case on my list for a while now, but it recently popped back up in the news, so I thought now's a good time to cover it, get into all the details. We're going to go through the very long journey of the life of a young mother whose children were abducted in a carjacking. The story seemed too cruel to be true, and the search for these two young boys was in the headlines nonstop for 9 days. It was only 9 days because the story wasn't true. This is the story of Susan Smith, a very troubled woman who did the unthinkable in the name of what she called love.
I'm getting a little familiarity with this.
I think you'll catch on.
Okay.
So I think the best way to fully understand Susan is to start at the beginning of her life because it's a doozy and it helps to explain her a bit more. Susan Lee Vaughn was born on September 26, 1972 in Union, South Carolina. Her dad, Harry, was a firefighter, and her mom helped to take care of her and her two older brothers. Their relationship wasn't great. Harry was an alcoholic and constantly accused Linda of having affairs. By 1977, when Susan was 5, Linda filed for divorce, but things got worse. On January 15th, 1978, around 2 a.m., Susan's dad, Harry, drunkenly showed up to the house with his soon to be ex wife and three kids inside, and with a gun, he grabbed one of Susan's brothers and her mom and threatened to kill everyone inside.
Whoa.
Linda was able to call the police, who arrived pretty quickly, and once at the house, officers witnessed Harry striking Linda. So then next part's a little confusing because all the reports say this little next event happened the same day. So like within a couple hours. So I'm assuming he did not get arrested for threatening to kill his entire family, but not entirely sure.
Okay.
Around 4:30 a.m. the same day, according to reports, Harry locked himself inside his house and shot himself in the stomach. He was able to call 911 and ask for help, seemingly immediately regretting it. Unfortunately, by the time police got into the locked house and were able to take him to the hospital, he died during surgery.
Shooting yourself in the stomach. That's crazy.
And I'm guessing because he locked every door and window, he was
Yeah.
planning on committing suicide and then immediately was like, oh shit, call 911.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the whole threatening the family thing aside, that's still sad, but
Very. So this obviously hurt Susan. She was very much a daddy's girl, and everyone said she was the light of Harry's life as well. Susan was actually told that her dad accidentally died while cleaning his gun, and she didn't learn the truth until years later. Only a few months after Harry's death, Susan's mom, Linda, married a wealthy local businessman named Beverly Russell Jr. Beverly was a prominent Republican, serving on several committees in South Carolina, and with his new fancy life, Linda moved her kids in with his kids in a bigger house in a nicer area. On the outside, things were going well, but Susan was severely depressed, according to everyone in her life, especially after she found out that her father committed suicide. She just kind of went down this like downward spiral, like, oh, he didn't want to be in my life. Like, he didn't want to be my dad. That's why he left. Kind of took it that way.
yeah.
By the age of 13, Susan had already attempted suicide twice. It gets worse because when she was around 15, her stepdad, Beverly, started to molest her. Susan did report this to her teachers, who reported it to the South Carolina Department of Social Services. The whole family was ordered to attend counseling and only ended up going a handful of times. In these sessions, Beverly, the stepdad, admitted to everything and talked about how sinful and wrong it was. But then Susan changed her tune and said it was a quote, mutually consensual, unquote, affair, and described how much she liked it because Beverly gave her more attention than he did her mom.
No.
Even though he admitted to molesting her, whatever she wants to call it, all that happened was they were sent for counseling. Anyways, in the end, Beverly ended up moving out, but I guess he stuck around a bit. I think all the kids were living with Susan's mom,
You're throwing
but
me off the name Beverly.
I'm just like imagining like a plump southern man with like a bow tie.
Yeah. Beverly?
Beverly. But Beverly, I guess, was still kind of around and it kept happening. Only a year later, Susan reported him again. And again, Beverly admitted to everything. But the local deputies closed the case despite pleas from social workers because Beverly was too prominent of a businessman, politician, and a good Christian family man. The same year, the summer between her junior and senior year of high school, Susan began working at the local Winn-Dixie, and she found the attention she had always been craving. She began to date two of her coworkers at the same time, one of whom was married. And for
Oh,
the non-Southern people, Winn-Dixie is a grocery store. Not a good one.
no.
Susan told her mom that she had the second and the third shifts at Winn-Dixie. But really, during this third shift, she was at this married guy's house while his wife was at her actual third shift job. During these little rendezvous, Susan fell pregnant and quietly got an abortion without telling anyone. Eventually, this married guy ended things after finding out Susan was also seeing someone else, even though he was married, but whatever. After this, Susan attempted suicide a third time, overdosing on aspirin and Tylenol.
And how old is she at this point?
I believe 17.
Oh, sad.
So this ended up with her being hospitalized for a little over a week before going back to work. Once back at the good old Winn-Dixie, she began dating an entirely different new coworker, David Smith. He was not married, but he was engaged. So while Susan's life wasn't exactly great on the outside, she was well off compared to David. He grew up in a poor, reclusive Jehovah's Witness house and didn't do well in school. Susan was now living in Beverly's big house and made it onto the National Honor Society. She was even voted the friendliest girl in her high school. David ended up rejecting his religion and moved into his great grandmother's house right next door when he and Susan began to officially date. They wanted to wait to have sex until marriage, but they could only wait until the second date. And after the second date, Susan was pregnant again.
Oh no.
So, and of course, being in the South, this meant a shotgun wedding. So they were actually very excited to get married and have kids. They thought they were like each other's soulmates. But 11 days before their wedding, David's brother Danny died from Crohn's disease. The wedding went on. David was 20, Susan was 19, and she was also 2 months pregnant. Afterwards, the happy couple moved into David's great grandmother's house and began to prepare for their new baby. David was still dealing with the death of his brother and was still pretty depressed about it, but this only got worse because only 3 months later, David's dad committed suicide.
Hmm.
A lot of suicide in this story. Heads
Yeah.
up. In October of 1991, Susan and David's first son was born. They named him Michael Daniel Smith, with his middle name being in honor of David's brother. Following Michael's birth, Susan was kind of on the up. She continued to work part-time at Winn-Dixie, and she enrolled in classes at the local campus of the University of South Carolina. By now, David was a supervisor at the store, but he was struggling, not only with grief, but now he was his wife's boss, straining their relationship. What strained their relationship further was Susan slacking on the job, flirting with customers, and overspending. Allegedly, Susan was having an affair with an ex, and David also had an affair in retaliation. So they were a little bit messy, just a little bit.
Just a little messy. Yeah.
In 1992, the couple separated, and Susan took Michael and moved back into her mom's house. David wanted things to work out, and a few months later, they started to hang out again, and surprise, Susan ended up pregnant from these hangouts. They got back together and ended up buying their own home in Union, and their son Alexander was born in August of 1993. Friends of the couple described their relationship as tumultuous. They never knew if they were living together or not. And then allegedly, again, Susan caught David in bed with another coworker. So apparently Winn-Dixie is like quite the hot spot for hookups. Good to know.
Yeah. Yeah. Winn-Dixie was the um Bumble of the times.
I guess they didn't have real Bumble back then. You had to go to Winn-Dixie.
You don't have that many options, just your coworkers at the Winn-Dixie.
Anyway, Susan left David again. Like before, David wanted to work things out for the sake of the kids, but this time Susan was done. She got a new job at Conso Products Company, and pretty soon after, she began to hook up with her boss's son, Tom Findley. I couldn't figure out if he was like married or engaged or in a relationship for sure. I saw some reports that he was, but not entirely sure about that.
Okay. I bet he was.
She has a type.
Yeah, I would put money on it.
But Susan told her friends that Tom was the ticket to a good life. He was a bit of a nepo baby. He was college educated and wealthy. This new affair went on for a few months until David found out about it. For some reason, Tom was totally turned off by the fact that Susan was still legally married, even though he might have been married, not entirely sure. Anyways, Susan ended up filing for divorce, and then after she told Tom, the affair picked back up again. This was until October 18th, 1994, when Tom wrote Susan a letter ending their relationship, which they work together. They see each other at least 5 times a week. They hang
Mm-hmm.
out after work. He mailed her the letter.
Seems odd. Did they stop communication after he sent the letter?
No,
Oh, so you would think like, oh, I'm gonna drop this in the mail and like disappear and go like that's the form of ghosting her. But if you don't, that's just a little weird.
even weirder, because he wrote and sent the letter before she filed for divorce, but it wasn't delivered until after.
Oh, that's awkward.
Real awkward. So Tom's justification in this letter is pretty long, it's out there, but his main point was that he wasn't ready to take on a woman with 2 kids. He did say Susan was a great person, and he was proud of the fact that she was a single mom taking night classes. He did, though, call her out for kissing and fondling another coworker in a
Goodness
hot tub
gracious.
during one of his parties.
Okay.
Tom said, quote, "To be a nice girl, you must act like a nice girl, and that doesn't include sleeping with married men." End quote. She ended up confronting Tom at work after she got the letter, and I don't know what her thought process was, but while confronting him, she blurted out that she had also slept with his dad slash her boss.
Cool. Nice.
I don't know. She thought Tom would be like, let's get back together. But
Right.
he's like,
Get
go
away
home,
from me. Yeah.
go. Tom reiterated that he was done with the relationship. He doesn't want to talk anymore. She can keep working there, whatever. And according to Susan, this meant that her life was over. October 25th, 1994 was the day everything went down. Susan went to work as normal and even went out to lunch with her coworkers, including Tom, who she sat beside at lunch. Weird. She was abnormally calm during the lunch, but went back to work like normal for a bit. This was until about 3 p.m. when she went to her supervisor, Sandy, in tears, asking if she could go home. Sandy was like, "What's going on?" And then Susan was like, "Oh, I'm in love with Tom Finley and he doesn't love me back." Her supervisor had no idea about any of this affair, whatever. And then she
Hmm.
knows Susan was wearing Tom's Auburn University sweatshirt at work. So Sandy let Susan go home early, but noticed out the window she had stopped to talk to Tom before getting in her car. Susan sped off, picked up her 2 sons from daycare before stopping at her local go-to bar with the kids. After
Oh.
that, I
What'd
guess
she do?
have
Sit with them at the bar with the kids?
I guess she needed a little liquid courage because then she went back to work with the kids, had another coworker watch them outside in the parking lot while she went back to confront Tom again.
Oh, okay.
So this time she admitted to making up the story about sleeping with his dad. So apparently that wasn't true. She just wanted to see how he would react.
Seems like an
Tom,
odd specific lie.
yeah, I still don't understand what the end goal with that was.
Yeah.
Whatever. Tom ended up telling her, he's like, just go home. I'll call you later. Susan drove off for the last time in her burgundy Mazda Protege and she drove around town for hours. During this drive with her kids in the back seat, Susan contemplated suicide again the entire time. She thought about how to go about it, what to do, but she didn't have a quick way out. While driving over a bridge, she thought about jumping while holding her sons, because there's no way they could live without their mom. Besides, her father's suicide messed her up, and she couldn't do that to her kids.
Oh, I know where this is going.
After driving for a while, and after the boys fell asleep, Susan parked onto a 75-foot long boat ramp on John D. Long Lake. Susan rolled up the windows, released the parking brake, got out, locked the doors, and pushed the car into the lake with her 2 sons inside. As the car slowly submerged into the lake, Susan ran up the ramp holding her hands over her ears so she wouldn't hear them scream.
Oh, okay. That's not what I thought was going to happen.
Oh, you thought they were going to jump?
I thought it was going to be all of them dying,
Oh no.
not just the kids. Okay.
Once at the top of the ramp, Susan wrapped her arms around herself and the auburn sweatshirt Tom had let her borrow. In Susan's own words, the next few minutes was just full panic. She contemplated suicide again, but there was a problem because now, all of a sudden, if she committed suicide, she wouldn't go to heaven in her mind. So instead, she quickly formulated a new plan, which would surely get her some more attention, and maybe even Tom would come back around. By now, it was around 9 p.m., and she began to run until she saw a house with their lights on. She caught her breath in the front yard, then began to feverishly pound on the front door, screaming for help. Shirley McLeod answered the door with her husband Rick standing behind her. As soon as the door was cracked, Susan yelled out, quote, please help me, please help me. He's got my kids in my car, end quote. Shirley ushered her into the house to ask what the hell happened while Rick instructed their son to call 911. During the call, Rick and Rick Jr. are asking for help while asking Susan for details to relay to the operator. Susan told them to tell law enforcement, quote, a black man has got my kids and my car, end quote. After ending the call with 911 at 9:12 p.m., Rick and Rick Jr. got into their car and sped off to find Susan's car and kids on their own, realizing they might be closer to them than the police. Shirley stayed behind with Susan to console her and ask for more details. Susan explained that while she was stopped at a red light on Monarch Street, a black man jumped into her car and ordered her to drive. He had her drive to the lake sign a few hundred yards from the McLeod's house and pushed her out. Susan then asked Shirley to call her mom, Linda, her stepdad, Beverly, and lastly, her separated husband, David. The police arrived shortly after to find Susan hurled over on a chair, crying inconsolably, wearing that auburn sweatshirt. No,
And of
I
course,
mean,
you had to say it was a black man.
of course it had to be a black man.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard of people getting carjacked and the people committing the carjacking not realizing like there's a kid in the back seat and they
Okay.
but they dump the kid out. You know what I mean? Like they don't want the
Yeah, they're
kid.
not trying to kill the kids usually. Like somebody that's a thief or a robber, like they're not usually like trying to kill people.
No.
And just like you could just simply drop the kids off pretty easily. But anyways, we know that's not true, but just people's like thought process just intrigues me of things like this. Like, what did you think? Did you really think that people are gonna buy this like weird story that you have that has no point or goal?
I think that's the thing is that there's no thinking going on.
Yeah, yeah. No thought processes are being, no wheels are turning. Okay.
No. So once police arrived, Susan went over her story again with them, and they quickly dispersed and began searching. A helicopter with heat sensors searched over the heavily dense forest while divers headed out straight to the lake.
Hmm.
You may have guessed it correctly, but no one found anything on land, and surprisingly, nothing was found in the lake either. I did look it up. It is 80 acres, so it is a bit much to search, so understandable.
Yeah.
Police also put out an emergency alert for the Burgundy 1999 Mazda Protege with a gash in its right front bumper, driven by a black man with two young white boys in the back. Susan described this black man as wearing a red, white, and blue plaid jacket, and he had a dark gun, which really narrows it down.
Yep.
Very large number of friends and family soon arrived at the McLeod house. Pretty much everyone Susan knew, except for Tom. Susan even had one of her friends call Tom to give him the news, but he did not answer.
Hey.
Around midnight, police were like, okay, this is too many people at a stranger's house. There's no signs of the boys being near the house anymore. Like, let's go to another central location. And so they decided on Susan's mom's, Linda's house. So David drove Susan in his car, and she asked to stop at her house on the way to just grab a couple things. David was like, okay, weird, but okay. And he kept asking over and over again, like, what happened? Like, what's the story? Where the hell are our kids? Instead of saying what happened, Susan calmly said, quote, listen, Tom Finley might come and see me. If he comes down, you can't get mad or anything. I don't want you two to get into a fight, end quote. David was obviously flabbergasted. His sons are missing. Yeah, Susan's worried about her little ex-boy toy. But
Yep.
spoiler alert, Tom didn't call back until the next day. And it was super brief, like, sorry about what happened. I hope they find them kind of thing. and he never once visited Susan.
Yeah.
What seems to be her goal in all this is to, I don't know.
Get his attention.
Yeah.
Also, like, I feel like she has some bad problems too, but still terrible thing to do. Okay.
At minimum, daddy issues.
At the minimum. Yeah.
Soon it was morning, and there were still no signs of the car or the boys. As the news broadcasts started rolling in, the story became a national and even international frenzy. On the 26th, both David and Susan were brought into the police station to get a more in-depth and formal statement. David didn't know much, obviously. He wasn't there. He did tell law enforcement that Tom had just ended his relationship with Susan over the kids. Susan went through all the details of the day, starting with the three of them having pizza at home and the boys for being fussy. She said her older son, Michael, wanted to go to Walmart. The investigator interviewing her was like, "Oh, Michael wanted to go to Walmart." Susan was like, "Well, actually, no, I suggested we go to Walmart." And she kept doing this. She'd be like, "Oh, Michael wanted to go to the park. Michael wanted to go to this friend's house." And then everybody be like, "Oh, Michael wanted to do this." And then she'd be like, "Oh, no, actually, that was my idea." Like, immediately backtracked on everything. It was not well done on Susan's part. In her story, Susan said they went to Walmart around 8:10 p.m. and looked at toys for Christmas, but they didn't make any purchases. After this, they drove around singing songs when she stopped at that red light on Monarch with no other cars around, and it all went down. The interviewer asked Susan straight up about Tom ending their relationship and him not wanting kids. Susan responded with, quote, "No man would make me hurt my children. They were my life," end quote. Catch the past tense?
Yep.
Susan was interviewed again on the 27th and 28th. She also ended up failing 3 polygraphs administered by the FBI. Shout out to Kate, who's not here today.
Hmm. They talk about that a lot, like catching people using the past tense. Like, that's just kind of a little red flag to people who do that.
I think about that all the time. I'm like, damn, if I slip up and say something,
Yeah.
I'm in for it. In these 3 interviews, Susan, as they went on, the first interview, she kept it cool, calm, and collected. And then as she kept being brought in and kept undergoing polygraphs, she stopped making eye contact with the interviewers. She would literally just like stare at the wall. She started fake crying and asking for tissues. And in one of the reports I read, the cop was like, "Why? You're not even crying." Like straight up to her face.
I love that.
So between interviews, Susan and David also appeared on local and national news, pleading for their son's safe return. Journalists and audiences everywhere quickly felt off by Susan, even creeped out at how disassociated she was. And so there's people like organizations that help parents deal with the media when their children are missing and handle all of that.
Yeah.
And they all declined to work with Susan because they didn't believe her. That's
No,
how bad
that,
she was at this.
yeah.
On October 28th, the sheriff's office held a press conference to announce that the boys were still missing and no suspects had been ruled out. Sheriff Wells said there were discrepancies in Susan's story, but he didn't go into details during this conference. So, what were these discrepancies? The first little tidbit was when Susan met with the police sketch artist to describe this mystery man who stole her car and children. So, something I never thought about, but makes complete sense. Sketch artists are trained to pick up on false allegations and lies. So, this one, he said Susan's description was super generic, just a black man. She didn't provide any corrections, like, oh, his nose was different or his jaw was this other shape. She was just
Hmm.
like, oh, okay, that's good. She was also making inappropriate comments like complimenting the artist and even asking if he would draw pictures of her kids for Christmas. And the artist also told investigators she would not stop talking about Tom, and she was still wearing that Auburn sweatshirt during this meeting.
Not the time, Susan. Not the time.
Never the time, Susan.
No, not the time to ask about Christmas photos. Like, goodbye.
Yeah, or talk about your ex-boyfriend. Another discrepancy was her saying they went to Walmart. She did later state they didn't buy anything, but even without a receipt, there were no witnesses placing her or the kids there that night. The biggest discrepancy was the red light that Susan said she was stopped at when it all happened. If you remember, she said there were no other cars at the intersection.
Mhm.
Officers knew this couldn't be true. The light at that intersection was like vehicle activated, so it wasn't on a timer. So the only way Susan's light would be red is if there were cars in the other lanes going the other direction. At first, officers thought, she's an emotional mess with her kids missing. She must have gotten the street name wrong or she was mistaken about the other cars, but she kept to this story throughout her multiple interviews. By now, it had been 9 days with zero sign of Michael, Alexander, or this mysterious black man. Police were certain that Susan's story wasn't true. They just needed a final push in order to get a confession. So they're like preparing to bring her in one final time to get this confession. So they made a fake news article about this woman who had killed a family member. And then she ended up getting out of jail like only a couple years later, and she married this nice, rich businessman. And their plan was to like give it to Susan to be like, see, like even if you confess and like go to jail, like you'll have a nice life after. Like you'll get the nice rich man when you get out.
Mhm.
I wish they would have used it, but
Yeah.
fortunately they didn't have to,
You know that would have worked.
for sure.
Yeah.
So on November 3rd, Susan was brought in for what she thought was to write a formal statement. But instead of going to the police station, Sheriff Wells brought her to a local Baptist church, thinking a holy place would make a religious Southern woman tell the truth. Susan wrote down her final statement and she changed something, the street name, from Monarch to Carlisle. Sheriff Wells picked up on this and realized she figured out Monarch Street didn't make sense. Carlisle also didn't make sense. There was an officer parked at that intersection all night, and there was no carjacking. With this, Sheriff Wells told Susan he knew it was all a lie and went into all of the reasons. Susan began to break down and she asked the sheriff to pray with her. They sat knee to knee in the church and prayed for a moment. Once finished, Susan asked for his gun to shoot herself.
Oh my. Okay. Yeah. You think that that's. Never mind. I'm
Yeah.
done.
Sheriff Wells was like, why? Why would you want to do that? And she's like, well, I killed my kids. And he was like, no shit. So the FBI was actually tucked away in the church and quickly began to question Susan further, asking what part of the lake the car was in. They had searched it twice by now without finding anything. The dive team went back out immediately and found the car. Eerily, as the divers swam up to it, one of the boys' hands were on the window, like he was trying to escape. Both of the boys were still trapped or strapped into their car seats. An autopsy was done promptly, beginning at 1 a.m. There was no evidence of external or internal injuries, and as you might have guessed, the cause of death was drowning. Later, police did a reenactment of the car being pushed into the lake, and with all the doors and windows shut, it would have taken 6 minutes for it to be fully submerged.
Oh my gosh. Can you, those 6 minutes were just terrible. That's horrible to think about.
She stood at the top of that boat ramp with her hands over her ears for 6 minutes.
And then ran and pretended to get help.
Susan Smith was officially arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. When it came time for a plea, Susan's defense team had an issue. She confessed and had even written it out, so what's left that could spare her from the death penalty? Pleading not guilty due to insanity. There's another problem, though, because in South Carolina, you can also be found guilty but mentally ill, which doesn't really change your sentencing. While awaiting trial, Susan was placed on suicide watch and regularly met with psychologists to see if there's any sort of diagnosis that could be used in her defense. Dr. Halleck, who later testified to all of this, said Susan at the most could be diagnosed with depressive disorder, not otherwise specified, which is like an other category when it doesn't really fit into anything else,
Okay.
but also not criminally insane.
Yeah.
When the trial rolled around, it was obviously a major spectacle with news crews lined up outside and a long line of people trying to get in to watch. The judge presiding over the trial decided that cameras would not be allowed due to the graphic nature, not just the murders, but also all of the sexual affairs that would be brought up. The prosecution's game plan was to use Tom's testimony in his letter to show that Susan was just a gold digger and she murdered her children to keep Tom. The defense's game plan was to highlight Susan's childhood trauma and depression. And get this, Beverly, the stepdad who may or may not, or I guess he admitted to molesting her when she was a teenager,
Mhm.
testified that him and Susan's affair continued up until 6 months before the murders.
Wow.
So she's married to David, she's hooking up with Tom and also her stepdad.
No comment.
No comment.
Yeah.
The defense also attempted to rewrite what happened. Their argument was that it wasn't a murder, it was a botched murder suicide. Their story was that Susan was planning on killing herself, like the story of her thinking of jumping off the bridge with her kids. But after she drove the car into the lake, she was in such a daze, she involuntarily jumped out and forgot about her kids inside.
Okay, I hope that no one buys that story.
They did not. The prosecutor had a field day with this and played the reenactment of the car submerging in the courtroom, showing that Susan had 6 minutes to get her kids out, and she didn't. The rest of the trial was pretty uneventful, just going over everything. And it
Mhm.
only took the jury 2.5 hours to return with a verdict: guilty. During the sentencing phase, the prosecutor and even ex husband David pushed for the death sentence, but the jury declined, and Susan was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. Susan was sent to the Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institution, but the drama does not stop there. Being a child killer, Susan has been continuously harassed and beaten up, which I am okay with. In 2000, Susan went to the medical staff in the prison to be treated for a sexually transmitted disease. And since she had been in prison for 5 years, people were like, how did you get this? How did that happen? Turns out,
No, no.
turns out she was having sex with two different guards at the
I
prison.
knew that's what you were gonna say.
These two guards did end up getting fired and they were charged with having sexual intercourse with an inmate. So they also went to prison over this.
Uh-huh.
Susan ended up being transferred to another prison and kept it low key for a bit until this year. In August of 2024, Susan was charged with a new crime, communicating with a victim and or witness. So turns out there's a documentary being made about the case, and one of the journalists was visiting Susan in jail and talking to her on the phone, which is illegal in South Carolina. Inmates aren't allowed to talk to journalists.
I think that's a good
Apparently,
policy, actually.
it is. But this journalist, he put money in Susan's commissary account, and then he also gave her David, the ex-husband's phone number and address so that she could contact him.
Don't tell me they're sleeping together.
Who knows?
Okay.
But after the prison found out about this, Susan lost her phone and canteen privileges for 90 days. And this journalist is banned from visiting her, which I think is a good thing. Once these 90 days were up, you might have seen the news, Susan was up for parole on November 20th, 2024. Appearing via video, Susan pleaded for mercy, saying God has forgiven her. David Smith, her ex husband, pleaded in front of the board and in the news to keep her behind bars. He stated she wasn't rehabilitated, she never will be. Luckily for everyone, Susan's request for parole was unanimously denied. Since she has served 30 years, she is eligible to apply for parole every 2 years now. Knowing Susan, I think she will apply every time. That's just my guess.
Yeah.
Which means every 2 years, David has to go back in front of the board and say, please don't. So I'm sure David will do whatever it takes to keep Susan behind bars. In 1995, he released a book called Beyond All Reason: My Life with Susan Smith, dedicated to Michael and Alex. Another book I read for research and recommend is Susan Smith by George Reekers. It goes into her whole psychology and it's super interesting. I actually read the whole thing, which I was not planning on doing. Another thing I really didn't touch on much, but wanted to bring up is the racial hoax that Susan committed. While luckily the police never believed the story about a black man kidnapping her children, that was the story in the news. And who's to say they may believe the next one? Obviously, there's racial tension and police brutality against black men in this country, but it was a more terrifying time in the 90s and especially in the South. Susan has never apologized for this, and one of her brothers ended up having to apologize for her in front of the courthouse after her confession. And that was the story of Susan Smith, who decided her two young sons, Michael and Alexander, were getting in the way of the life she wanted.
That is terribly sad. Um, for those kids. I mean, she could have, I mean, it was all in the sake of getting this guy's attention. And that's horrible.
I don't think Tom was going to take her back in any way, but if it's because the kids are getting in the way, why not give up custody to your ex-husband, who still obviously very much loves him, loves the kids and wants him?
Yeah. I feel
Yeah.
like I've heard similar stories with there's a word for when parents kill children, and I think that's different, a different word for men and women. But
Hmm.
I feel like I've heard of this like plot, this storyline before, like killing to get the attention of someone else or because you have another lover and you're just like tired of your family. Um, just crazy to think about that this happens. Also, another really weird thing, I didn't think a sketch artist would be able to detect lies, but that's very interesting that you brought that up too.
I know it's something I didn't think about, but I was like, okay,
Huh.
that makes total sense. I'm stupid.
Like they know how a normal person describes someone that they see and like what level of detail,
Yeah.
depending on how you saw them. But I'm sure I didn't think about that they would be able to tell that you didn't actually see that person. Like your story doesn't match with what you're describing. No, that's pretty cool.
I guess we don't give them enough credit.
No, we don't because we're always like, it looks like a generic sketch. It doesn't look like anybody. But
My formal
you can have
apologies.
that one. You can have that one, sketch artists.
We actually did for a Christmas post last year, little Instagram carousel for Diane Downs in Oregon,
Mhm.
who claimed during a carjacking her three kids were shot and she drove them to the hospital. But it turns out it was her so that she could be with a married man who didn't want kids. So very similar.
Okay, I feel like I remember that. Yeah. Yep.
And that was about 10 years before. So maybe that's where she got the idea.
Yeah, maybe she heard about it and copied it. Huh. I think the word is like familicide or something like that, where you're killing family member. I don't know.
It's called filicide, the deliberate act of a parent killing their own child.
Yep.
All right, I'm gonna jump into overtime.
Overtime.
I want to know your thoughts because I have a very hard rule on this. When is a socially acceptable time to put up and take down your Christmas tree?
Okay. So I have a lot of thoughts about this topic, so I'm very glad that you brought it up. So I used to be of the opinion that you cannot decorate until for a holiday until the most recent holiday is over. So like don't decorate for Christmas until Thanksgiving is over. I've
Yes.
kind of changed my mind a little bit. I think some things are okay. For instance, my mom and Luke's mom both put their tree up but didn't decorate it. So they had their tree up during Thanksgiving, but it wasn't decorated. I think that that's acceptable, socially acceptable. I will accept it. I think it's okay to do like basic Christmas lights
Hmm.
without like craziness, like
The
without the
bl
actual thing.
the blow ups in the front yard.
Yeah, like don't blow those up yet.
Yeah.
Like not the time. But I know that the companies decorate houses, they start so early. And also, we'll say you can hang your Christmas lights without turning them on.
Hmm.
Keep that in mind. And I think that after New Year's, it must come down.
So I agree with you. I
However, one more thing. However, I do follow this influencer that she keeps her Christmas tree up and she decorates her Christmas tree for like New Year. She does a different decoration for Valentine's Day. And I thought that it was sickening at first. And then I realized that I kind of liked it. But I would never do it personally. But I did like the idea. I don't want everybody doing it though.
no, I think you have to have a lot of money and you have to have good design skills.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah. Yep.
No,
Those are my thoughts. Yours. What's your thoughts?
very similar to yours. I say December 1st, go all out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go all out. And
Yeah.
then January 2nd, 3rd, start bringing it down. Start taking it down.
Yep. You can celebrate the New Year's. You can be hungover on New Year's Day, but then pick yourself up by your bootstraps and you got to start. You got to start. You got to wrap it up, you know?
Yeah, once you go back to work, after New Year's, you come home and you start packing it up.
Yep. Let's get it going. I agree because you ruin the Christmas spirit if you drag it out for so long. It's like it should be a small amount of time that you get this Christmas happiness and the Christmas feeling, and then it's over, and then it's done, and you have to stop. I have so many people in Russellville that I have seen just driving around that keep their Christmas lights up way too long. Some of them keep them up a lot longer than you should, like maybe the entire time. And I'm not calling anybody out, but you can unplug them. You don't have to take them down. Like if that's not something that you can do, just unplug them.
No,
You'll
I mean,
save electricity.
and I'm okay with if you want to get like the more permanent ones installed and they're just up, just keep them turned off.
Yeah, you do you. But you've got to be respectful of the Christmas spirit. You do.
I think we should run an HOA.
Yeah. Like for states individually, like not just like a neighborhood, like it's mandated by the state. We need to add that to our list of like, what do we have lists going? We have like a list of if you were president, like what would you do day one? That I'm adding that to my list. If you have Christmas lights up past New Year's, it's $1,000 a day.
It's
Past the second of New Year or past January 2nd, criminal offense,
see, I think,
demeanor, but you're gonna pay a fine.
yeah, I think if
Yeah.
we suck up to Trump enough, we could create a whole department for
Yes,
the Department of Holidays.
we would be appointed the head of the Department of Holidays.
Oh, we have to push for this.
I think we should. Have you seen the video of Melania Trump where she's decorating for Christmas and she's like, I don't give a about Christmas, but I have to do the Christmas decorations, no?
I will say she did have some good decorations for someone who
Oh my
hated
gosh, they
it.
were so good, actually. Hey, she's got style, that's for sure.
They had, I went to Michael's the other day and they had those like red flocked Christmas trees and they had like red velvet Christmas trees like she had in the White House.
She
So
started something
she did.
there. Mm-hmm.
She started something.
Give it to her. Those were pretty good.
I will say if I ever became ridiculously rich, I would be going all out
Oh my
for
gosh.
every holiday.
Have you seen how the Kardashians, like it is a carnival set up in their house for every single holiday, which
No,
I think that's amazing.
I saw last year Kim apparently bought out an entire Christmas tree farm and had all the Christmas trees planted in her yard in fake snow for like the whole month.
That's so crazy.
I would totally do that if I
That's
had that kind
something
of money.
we can do. If we ever go to wherever all these famous people live, LA, I don't know, and we should drive. I bet they don't let you just drive through the neighborhoods.
No,
Look at
no.
the signs.
We'd have to go
Oh, that's
undercover. We could go undercover as like, I don't know,
gardeners,
yes, lawn care.
closet organizers,
We'll figure it out. We'll do it.
head of the holiday department. Open up the gates.
I'm gonna make us badges as soon as we log off.
All right. Well, I'm gonna go decorate for Christmas.
And with that, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Over My Dead Pod. Be sure to give us a follow. Check out our blog on overmydeadpod.com and on social media at overmydeadpod for more updates. And we'll see you next week with another case. Bye.
Bye.